Um, I met the pianist James Williams when I was still in high school, and I met him at the time it was called the National Association of Jazz Educators, which then became the International Association of Jazz Educators, which then became the JEN, the Jazz Education Network. But um, I met him at a conference in about 1986, and I knew him because I had a couple of albums of his that I bought at my local record store here in Eau Claire when I was a kid. And I said, well, there's James Williams. I'm going to ask him for a lesson. So he became a good friend and a mentor of mine. And when I moved to Boston right after high school to go to Berkeley, James lived in New York, and I would take the train down to New York, every other weekend or whenever I had a little extra money, and would hang out with James, crash on his couch in Brooklyn, and he'd take me around either to gigs he was doing or to just, club hopping around New York, which, as you know, was a pretty incredible scene in those days, Bradley's and all that stuff. And he took me up to a club called McKell's one night up on the Upper West Side where Art Blakey was playing. And he introduced me to Art and said, hey, Art, you should hear this young piano player. He knows your music. And Boo was just like, well, come on and play something with us. So literally, Benny Green, who was the pianist at the time, just graciously let me sit in. We played, I think, Mayray and Monin. And I want to preface this by saying I had a band all through high school that played a bunch of Messinger's repertoire. And also, when I was going to Berkeley, I was in the Art Blakey ensemble, which was led by Billy Pierce. So it was a real law of attraction kind of thing for me. But even long before that became, pop psychology. I mean, it really was how I was living my life. I said I didn't really ever have any question in my mind that I would somehow one day be in that band. I was also kind of arrogant at the time, but it really, between Benny Green and James Williams and Bill Pierce and John Ramsey and a couple other people who were in Art's circle, they all vouched for me and Art let me sit in a couple times, and then he somehow they got I moved to New York after a year at Berkeley, so I moved to New York in the summer of 1989, summer fall, and within a week of moving to New York, somehow Art got my number and called me up and said, "I want you to join my band and start with us at Sweet Basil in September." And it was just like, "Yay, dream come true!" Absolutely. Um, and I ended up being the last pianist in that band before Art passed in September, October of 1990 when Art died. So I got to do a year in the band, but I am so thankful that opportunity happened, and I was able to jump on it and really be prepared for it too. Oh, very profoundly. Not only in terms of my attitude towards playing jazz. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to play the music, but if you know Art Blakey's music, it was really full on. That swing beat was loud and strong, and it always felt good. And that feeling of that beat is permanently stitched into my DNA now. And so when I play with any other drummer, I still want to feel that. If we're playing a swing beat, I want to feel that kind of strong pulse. And also in terms of Art as a band leader and how he would shape or program a set of music. And it always had a good, like a movie or like a good story. It always had a good arc to it. And he would throw in the hits at the appropriate times. And sometimes, if the audience seemed a little, he would really read the audience and kind of adjust the set according to what kind of vibe he was getting back. And if the audience seemed a little restless, if they didn't, maybe we were playing a bunch of new tunes that they didn't know, wham, he would go into Blues March or Monin and something that everybody knew. And Art also, he would always feature somebody in the band, and he talked to the audience too. Art really understood how to break that fourth wall and how to meet the audience halfway. And he would always say, um, and it's more like a philosophy. I'm not really quoting Art Blakey directly here, but he understood the relation between, or the ratio between, entertainment and art. and then he knew the music we were doing was at a really high level artistically, but also understood that the audience chooses to be there and buys a ticket and pays, maybe saves up for a month to buy a ticket to a show, and you want to send them home feeling like they got their money's worth and feeling good and positive about life. So I think Art really was able to strike a really good balance that way. How to miss planes and catch the next one and still make the gig on time. um I'm partially joking. uh a lot of it was just by osmosis. I mean, just the experience of being on the road and watching Art deal with the pitfalls of the road sometimes. um Art would always come to our defense too as young musicians. When I was in the band, it was 1990 when we had that first uh, invasion of Kuwait, and the Desert Storm and all that stuff. And as an 18-year-old, there was about three of us in the band that were 18, and we were all worried we were going to get drafted, even though it probably hadn't been a draft in 30 years. But what if they have a draft? And Art said, "Don't worry, fellas. If the Army calls you up, I'll go down there and talk to them." Very paternal. He said, "I'll tell them you guys are jazz musicians. You can't go in the Army." All that kind of stuff. So the bassist was Essiet, Javon Jackson on tenor sax, Brian Lynch on trumpet, and that was the core band. And then Frank Lacey was on trombone when I joined, and he was replaced by Steve Davis. And Donald Harrison had returned to the band. He was in the band back in the early 80s, and he returned for a few months at the beginning of my stint, and then he was replaced by an Australian tenor sax player named Dale Barlow. So we had two tenor saxes for a while. And then at the very end, right before Art passed, we did a handful of gigs just as a quintet again, which was the original Messengers lineup, way back. So it was kind of cool to return to that format, just to, play some of that music and with that kind of sound. He kept playing. I think he was probably sick the whole year that I was in the band. And, as a result, his energy was, it varied. But when, he had good nights and bad nights. But man, when he had good nights, they were really, really good nights. And it was pretty amazing. Um, I think the very last gig we did was in Osaka, Japan, at the Osaka Blue Note, and Art was really, really unwell, and he was sitting on his drum throne and kind of teetering, and really, and he motioned to our trombonist Steve Davis to come over. He said, "Steve, hold me up." So Steve comes over and crouches behind him, and he's propping Art up on the drum throne, and Art turns around, he goes, "Don't make it so obvious." you know and Art, also he had a really unique way of dealing with racism too. And because the band I was in was mostly white, and somebody asked him one time, "Art, why do you have so many white guys in the band?" And Art just says, "I'll look into it." He had his sort of stock thing that he would say at the end of every gig, which I guess was his philosophy about death, which was, he always said, "An armored car never follows a hearse." So basically, he was telling the audience, he said, "Spend your money, folks. Buy our records." He would always say, "Buy our records because God knows we need the money." And he said, "You never see an armored car following a hearse." Can't take it with you. Live your life while you're here, kind of thing. A lot of drummers play loud. Art played loud. Um, a lot of drummers play very, very loud. But one of the things that made Art different was that the actual patterns he played on the drums weren't extremely busy all the time. They weren't particularly complicated. Um, they could be complex, but they never got in the way. So it wasn't like he was bashing on all kinds of drums all the time. So what it did was create a lot of space. The volume and the energy level was pretty extreme, but within that you still had space to play. Um, And the other thing is it made me really aware of his comping rhythms. So, you're playing drums usually to ride cymbal with the right hand, snare drum and other drums with the left. And all those things are rhythms. So when you're a pianist and you're comping chords, let's say, you're going those kind of things. Those are offbeats, right? Um, those are those are sometimes snare drum patterns on the drum set. So it made me really focus on what he was doing with his left hand, and sometimes try to match the rhythms he was playing. And that kind of training carries over into playing with other drummers too. Just that that kind of conditioning into listening to what the drummer's doing. Oh yeah, yeah. Everybody in the band had to write, and sometimes under duress. you know, we did one record. We did a couple of records in the band I was in, but the last one we made was called One for All, and it was on A&M Records, and John Schneider produced it. Um, but we it was kind of a typical old school way of keeping you at arm's length. He would never he never tell you when anything was. So you'd find out you had a European tour, like the day you were supposed to leave for Europe. So it's typical Art. I think the session was on a Thursday, and he called up on Tuesday night and said, hey, we're going into the studio Thursday. I said, oh great, we're gonna make a new record. I said, great, Art. What are we gonna play? He goes, I don't know. You got some music, don't you? So everybody in the band stayed up 2 nights, stayed up all night writing music for this date. But Art could learn. He didn't read music, um, but he could hear it and he could memorize it really, really quickly. And so if anyone wrote a new tune for the band would get together to rehearse. I think we had 2 or 3 rehearsals that during the year I was in the band, but never with Art. Art would never show up for rehearsal. He would just show up on the gig and play. So you'd play your new tune that you wrote, and we would write around the kinds of we try to write in the style of the band, to write stuff that Art would be familiar with. So it's not like we'd be coming in as young musicians with, hey, look at my new tune in 15/8 or 17/8 with all this crazy stuff. No, you'd write something that was reminiscent of classic Art Blakey music. Um, and Art would just come in and kind of feel his way through it and sometimes make some mistakes, but the next night he would have it absolutely 100%. Not only not only learn your tune, but already put his personality on it, and he made it an Art Blakey tune. You know, he would talk about Charlie Parker sometimes, and that was always really great to be sitting next to him on the bus when he'd start talking about Bird. And it was he would sometimes he would quote things Bird said, which I can't even remember, but they were always kind of really, really hip, hyper intellectual, encoded kinds of things. You know, um, and he would just say, "Man, Charlie Parker could play anything. He just basically, he could sight read anything. Could play out of any classical etude book, play any kind of jazz. Just absolutely, genius musician on every level." I mean, I know that Art loved Japan and Japan loved him, and he collected. He didn't. When you went over to his apartment in New York, he didn't have a lot of stuff. He wasn't someone who accumulated a lot of things over the years, and he got rid of everything kind of as he went. But he did keep. He had like Japanese dolls, and he really liked Japan and Japanese culture. So if he had any kind of stuff around the house, it was probably something Japanese.